Seminole were a group of refugees made up of peoples from the Alabama, Choctaw, Yuchi, Yamasee, and most importantly, the Creek ethnicities. These peoples had fled to the Spanish colony of Florida from expanding American influences and were largely made up of people who were not really used to the Floridian environment, quite, because as they weren't natives like the Calusa or the Appalachee. So therefore, the Seminole had to adapt to this new environment, and the Spanish allowed the Seminole to live in Florida. However, in 1819, Florida would be bought from the Spanish by the United States. American authorities had already invaded Florida in 1816, and the Spanish had expressed outrage over this invasion. But in 1819, when Florida was purchased by the Americans, it would become their territory. And in 1823, the Seminole would be forced to sign a treaty known as the Treaty of Moultrie Creek, which would move the Seminole from northern Florida in the Panhandle down to a new reservation in the middle of the peninsula. And while 6 Seminole leaders refused this treaty, it was still enforced upon the Seminole as a whole. Seminole having been moved to a new reservation in the center of the Florida Peninsula, there were still calls for the Seminole to move again. And by 1827, many American forces were calling for the Seminole to be moved west of the Mississippi River to Oklahoma, or as they called it at the time, Indian Territory. So therefore, there was much argument between the Seminole and the American government over multiple different issues, one of which being that the Seminole were considered by the United States to be simply Creek that had recently left the Creek peoples. However, the Seminole denied any relationship with the Creek and stated that they were their own unique culture distinct from the Creek. And another issue was that of the Black Seminoles, who were escaped slaves that had taken refuge with the Seminole and were included in Seminole society. These people were considered to be escaped slaves by the United States government, and slave catchers were often sent to try to capture these slaves from the Seminole. In 1834, the Treaty of Paynes Landing will be ratified by the U.S. Congress, with only 7 Seminole leaders being forced to sign it. This would spark outrage amongst the Seminole, and many would refuse to move, including Micanopy of the Alachua Seminole and a young warrior by the name of Osceola. The United States gave the Seminole 3 years to move, starting in 1832, but by the time of its ratification in 1834, the Seminole only had 1 year to move. 1835, 2 companies, 110 men, under the command of a major by the name of Francis Dade, would leave Fort Brooke in modern Tampa with the destination of Fort King in modern Ocala. Dade knew that his force was being shadowed by Seminole scouts, but figured that he could avoid being flanked by the Seminole if he kept up a fast enough pace. By the time he reached the location of the Dade battlefield in what is modern Bushnell, he believed that he had gotten out of the area where an ambush could have been laying in wait, because the foliage in the area is so low that it is hard to conceal oneself when they are standing upright. However, many of the Seminole, under the command of Micanopy, lay down or crouched in the underbrush and waited for Dade's force to come by. In the ensuing ambush, 108 of the 110 people in Dade's 2 companies were killed by the Seminole. And this would go on to start the Second Seminole War. The Second Seminole War would last 7 years and end in 1842 with the Seminole being forced to concede to their American enemies. The Seminole had been chased to the very end of the Florida Peninsula in order to defend their homeland, but in the end, the Americans still did not recognize their sovereignty and lumped the Seminole into the same reservation in Oklahoma as the Creek. The Seminole had attempted to fight for their homeland to the very last man, and as stated by Osceola, "You have guns and so have we. You have powder and lead and so have we. You have men and so have we. Your men will fight and so will ours, until the very last drop of the Seminole's blood has moistened the dust of his hunting ground."